Welcome back to this series of Black Hat Executive Spotlights. We're joined now by Robert McCardle, Director of Cybercrime Research with Trend Micro. Robert, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
The topic du jour, of course, is ransomware. It's obviously enterprises' biggest worry and ongoing concern with good reason. Give us a snapshot, if you would, about how things are evolving here, and depending on how clear your crystal ball is today, what do you see coming at us in the future?
Yeah, so ransomware is a constantly evolving threat. It's one that, as bad as it looks on a given month, it just keeps getting worse, right? Which is not great. But they're constantly evolving new business models. And one of the unfortunate things in cybercrime is, unlike in the traditional world, if a cyber criminal group come up with a new way of doing business or a new method, everybody just copies them because there's no copyright infringement law and stuff that would happen in the real world. So we see groups innovate and then everybody else pretty much take that on about a month later. So some of the one that your watchers will be more familiar with is the kind of double extortion, where both you have the ransomware element and then you also have the threat of leaked data. That's become essentially commonplace now at this point. But we're also seeing it start to evolve where some groups are doing, even, I know this sounds buzzwordy, but treble or even quadruple extortion. And what we mean by that is, for example, with the leaked data, they will actually go through it, find all your customers' email addresses, and then email them saying, unless the victim pays, your data is going out. And of course, that puts the board in an impossible position because you now have your customers that are asking you to pay the ransom, essentially. So they're constantly evolving and adding to it. And that's unfortunately going to likely keep going for the foreseeable future.
Another trend that I'd like you to speak to is there used to be quite a division between, say, nation state attackers and your run-of-the-mill sort of cybercrime activists. That's obviously gotten a lot grayer in the last several months and quarters. Talk a bit about what's driving that, and what does this mean for organizations who are trying to protect themselves from what would appear to be a much larger and more powerful threat?
Yeah, so traditionally, if you go back maybe 5 years, it's relatively easy to put with distinction whether an attack was maybe nation state and source or criminal in source, because one's financially motivated, one is not. Now the lines are blurring for several reasons. In the case of some states, their interests are financial. If they're under heavy sanctions, for example, then bringing money to the economy makes perfect sense. So that makes things a bit blurrier because you see them like stealing, banking information and things which you wouldn't normally associate with like a military intelligence type operation. And then also what you see in other states is that because the amount of people who get arrested for cybercrime is relatively low, it means if you go into it from a criminal point of view initially, and then you mature and you've now been doing this for 10 years of your criminal career, if you like, you're probably going to be noticed by some of these agencies in your country. You may even be hired or approached because you're smart, you know what you're doing. People are always looking for good employees. And then they may move on to those organizations. Or alternatively, what we've seen kind of emerge is the kind of emergence of, for want of a better word, Cyber-Mercenaries. So people who majority of their time is still the criminal activities that they've been doing and has been going well for them, but they will occasionally have a customer who would be a state or a person with interest politically and that kind of thing. And that becomes murky when you track these groups because you see one day they're going after something very much criminal orientated and theft and so on. And the next day the targets seem to make no sense from that point of view, but they may be an opposition leader in the country or something along those lines. And this Cyber-Mercenaries type setup is quite concerning because there's no regulation on that there is in maybe more physical warfare or physical intelligence, right, where that's been more regulated over the years. So we're seeing groups like that. In fact, we have a talk, Black Hat this year on a group like that, and we expect more and more of them to come along because the criminals are getting older. They're more mature. They're looking for jobs that have nice pensions and things like that, or send the kid to work. And just because you've stolen 10 million of somebody in ransomware doesn't mean you don't have to drive the kid to school, right? So people start thinking differently as they mature in life.
Wow, it's like become a whole mature business, hasn't it?
It very much is. People think of cyber criminals because how they're portrayed, right? The hacker hoodie, in a basement thing. And if you are still wearing a hoodie in your mom and dad's basement after you've stolen like 10 million in a month, then you are doing something wrong, right? You should have bought your parents a nicer house and they can live in there, and you have your own basement where if you want, right? And you drive your Ferrari between them. So there's that, like, criminals at that level are running businesses. That's exactly what they are. And we've already seen this like for millennia and every other major criminal operation, like the mafias around this world, they're criminal businesses and so on. And that is what cybercrime looks like today. If you look like a cyber criminal business, it is a business. They have tech support, sales, even HR to a degree, like hiring and firing people, all of that kind of stuff.
This seems like a good time to bring up the topic of risk. Obviously, the world has gotten more connected. As that happens, the risk level increases. But I think one of the sort of unintended consequences of this is it forces more risk assessment, I guess, onto the end user, and being able to discern, say, like what a conference presentation, if that's out in the world somewhere versus, the quarterly spreadsheets, that kind of thing. Talk a bit about the difference between the two and how this is leading to scalable business models for cyber criminals.
So I think sometimes what we see at a conference, when we see like, such and such a device could be hacked or something like that. And there's also, some of it gets reported because it's flashy or the device is well known by people or the protocol is well known by people. And then there's always a question of, well, will that happen in the real world, right? Will a criminal take advantage of that? Now, partially, criminals will go after what's profitable and what is easiest for them. So if there's two ways to break into a network and one is slightly easier than the other, they'll do that, right? It's like water flowing through cracks. However, the big benefit that those kind of investigations and research give is they highlight risks in places that for companies may not be aware of them. So take, for example, like a critical business being shut down, like something like the pipeline in America, the Colonial Pipeline recently, or the health service executive in Ireland and so on. Those would be considered critical, high-risk environments if they go offline and you don't want them to. And in both cases, the attack was on the traditional production network, if you like, the Windows machines that people are checking their email on and so on. It wasn't on the hospital scanners or the pumps and that type of thing. However, when you do research on, let's say, the protocols that make those pumps work or that make the MRI machine work and so on, and you show that they're breakable because they were never really designed with security in mind, what you're doing is really important. You're highlighting something that people see as their crown jewels, right? That they have to protect at all costs. And you're showing it to that business saying, this thing's breakable. And that forces a board discussion from them to go, okay, well, that's breakable. What else is breakable? And then that they start thinking in terms of risk. So even if it mightn't be that protocol or that device or that whatever, they're now thinking about everything else. And they are also now thinking about securing the Windows machine with that maybe gets the email, as much as they are about the stuff that if it goes wrong is catastrophically bad. You get that balance. So at least you get those risk discussions taking place.
Well, Robert, thank you for that sobering deep dive into the woolly world of ransomware. I appreciate you joining us for this executive spotlight today.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
We've been talking with Robert McCardle, Director of Cybercrime Research at Trend Micro. This has been Terry Sweeney for Black Hat. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.